The pilot was following every emergency procedure, but he was losing the one thing the manuals couldn't teach him: his nerve. Until a 3-year-old girl, who shouldn't have been out of her seat, did what 200 trained adults could not. This is the story of Atlantic Skyways Flight 602, a routine transatlantic flight that turned into a cockpit nightmare over the ocean. It asks a dangerous question. What happens when every train protocol fails, and salvation comes from the one person never allowed in the room? A person who, by every law of physics and federal regulation, should have been buckled tightly in row 23. To understand how a 3-year-old could reach a locked cockpit, you first need to meet the man inside it. Captain Elias Vance was, by every metric, a pilot's pilot. 17 years with Atlantic Skyways, over 20,000 hours in the air, a reputation for coolness that bordered on legendary. He was the pilot other pilots pointed to during simulator sessions. Fly it like Vance. But that reputation was a fossil. It was built on a version of himself that hadn't existed for 2 years and 9 months. Not since the Tuesday afternoon he lost his first officer. It wasn't a crash. It was a medical event, a cerebral aneurysm mid-descent into Frankfurt. First Officer Marcus Chen, 34 years old, father of a newborn, simply slumped forward onto the yoke. Vance had to fight the controls, declare an emergency, and land the heavy aircraft alone while the cabin crew tried and failed to revive his friend in the seat beside him. Marcus didn't die in the air. He died 47 minutes later on the tarmac. And Elias Vance, the man who landed the plane and saved 217 lives, never got past the image of Marcus's head on his shoulder as they tried to lift him out of the seat. The airline gave him 8 months of paid leave, mandatory therapy, a clean bill of health from the aviation psychologists. He returned to duty, but the silence of the right seat was a physical weight. He started hearing phantom alerts. He jerked his head to the right, expecting to see Marcus pointing at a dial and find only empty space. The coolness was gone, replaced by a meticulous, brittle focus. He flew the procedures perfectly, but the joy, the instinct, the asterisk flow was gone. He was managing a machine, not commanding a sky. On the morning of November 12th, Captain Vance reported for Flight 602, JFK to London Heathrow. A Boeing 777, 203 souls on the manifest, light cargo. His first officer was a competent young pilot named David Shaw, 7 years with the airline, eager, by the book, and acutely aware of flying with the legendary, if now silent, Captain Vance. The pre-flight was normal. The weather was clear. The aircraft, ship named Valkyrie Asterisk, checked out fine. It was supposed to be a milk run. Across the airport in Terminal 4, a woman named Anya Petrova was wrestling a pink backpack onto her 3-year-old daughter's shoulders. Lena Petrova had dark, curly hair that defied hair ties and a stuffed rabbit named Binky that had seen better days. Anya was a freelance graphic designer traveling to London for a last-minute, career-making client meeting. Her usual childcare, her sister, had come down with the flu the night before. Anya faced a choice: cancel the trip and likely lose the client, or bring Lena. She had called the airline. Yes, a lap infant ticket was available. Yes, it was allowed. It was a terrible idea and she knew it, but the rent was due on the 1st and the client wasn't going to wait. Anya's anxiety was a live wire. Lena, sensing it, had been fussy and clingy from the moment they left their Brooklyn apartment. She didn't want to be carried. She didn't want to walk. She wanted to be home. By the time they boarded and found their seat in row 23, Anya was already exhausted. She buckled Lena onto her lap with the extra loop belt, handed her Binky, and prayed for a smooth flight and an early nap. Captain Vance, meanwhile, was in the final stages of his cockpit flow. His hands moved over the checks with automatic precision, but his mind was elsewhere. It was the smell. The specific, sterile smell of the cockpit's recycled air had somehow become fused in his neural pathways with the smell of sweat and fear from that day over Frankfurt. Every time he took his seat, it triggered a low-grade hum of dread. He managed it. He breathed through it. He told no one. To First Officer Shaw, He was just a quiet, intensely focused captain. Flight 602 pushed back on time at 9:45. Vance's voice over the PA was calm, professional, devoid of any discernible emotion. Flight attendants, cross-check and prepare for departure. The engine spooled up. The taxi began. In row 23, Lena clutched Binky and watched the world move sideways out of the window. The takeoff was flawless, a clean, powerful climb into the brilliant blue over the Atlantic. For the first hour, everything was textbook, the autopilot engaged. Shaw managed the communications. Vance monitored the systems, his eyes flicking across the screens, his body rigid in the seat. He declined Shaw's offer of coffee. The hum of dread had settled into its usual background noise. He could manage this. He was managing this. Then, 93 minutes into the flight, at 37,000 feet, the first alarm sounded. It wasn't a blaring catastrophe. It was a single, persistent chime, a master caution light illuminated on the overhead panel. Shaw identified it first. "Captain, we've got an indication. Left engine oil pressure, it's fluctuating." Vance's head snapped up. His heart, which had been beating a steady, controlled rhythm, gave a hard, painful thump against his ribs. Oil pressure. Not an engine fire, not a flameout, but a precursor. A problem that could escalate unpredictably in the middle of an ocean. His training kicked in. "Run the checklist," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. They ran it. The pressure continued to bobble. Then a second light, engine vibration. The data on the screen showed the left engine was running rough. The aircraft, a twin-engine jet, was now facing a potential failure on one side over the middle of the Atlantic. The procedure was clear. They would need to divert. The nearest adequate airport was Shannon, Ireland, over an hour away. Vance made the announcement. His voice was still calm, but it had a metallic edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a minor technical indication with one of our engines. As a precaution, we will be diverting to Shannon Airport in Ireland. The flight attendants will prepare the cabin. There is no immediate danger." In the cabin, a murmur of worry spread. Anya Petrova held Lena tighter. The little girl felt her mother's tension and began to whimper. "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay," Anya whispered, her eyes wide, staring at the blank seat back in front of her. In the cockpit, the situation was degrading. The oil pressure began a slow, steady drop. Not rapid, but undeniable. The engine wasn't failing explosively. It was sick and getting sicker. Vance initiated the turn towards Shannon. He and Shaw were a flurry of quiet, precise activity, coordinating with air traffic control over the ocean, running more checklists, preparing the aircraft for a possible single-engine landing. And then the third alarm. A new, sharper chime, a fuel imbalance warning. The rough engine was consuming fuel erratically. Now they had two related problems stacking on top of each other. The procedures became more complex. The mental load increased. Vance's breathing shallowed. He could feel a fine tremor starting in his left hand, the one resting on the throttle quadrant. He clenched it into a fist. First Officer Shaw, focused on his screens, read out the updated landing data for Shannon. "Single-engine approach speed will be 150 knots. Will be heavy with fuel. It's a solid crosswind from the right today, Captain. 15 knots gusting to 22. Vance heard the words, but they seemed to bounce off a glass wall in his mind. Crosswind, single engine, heavy. The variables were multiplying, and beneath the numbers a darker, more paralyzing thought surfaced. This is how it starts. This is the cascade, just like with Marcus. He wasn't in a cockpit over the Atlantic. He was back over Frankfurt, fighting the controls alone with a dead man beside him. The sterile smell was now the smell of panic. The hum of dread became a roar. His responses to Shaw became clipped, delayed. His scan of the instruments grew fixated, locked on the sinking oil pressure number as if staring at it could will it to stop. He was following the procedures, but the Supreme Commander's confidence, the ability to synthesize all the data into a clear picture, was fracturing. He was becoming a passenger in his own cockpit. Shaw noticed. He shot a concerned glance at his captain. "Captain Vance, we're cleared for the descent, your controls." Vance didn't answer immediately. He was staring straight ahead, through the windshield at the endless blue. His knuckles were white on the yoke. The tremor had spread to his leg. The psychorespiratory cycle was taking hold, the breath quickening, the heart pounding, the mind narrowing to a tunnel of perceived threat. The very training designed to prevent this was being drowned out by a memory 2 years and 9 months old. And in row 23, Lena Petrova's whimpering had turned into full, frustrated tears. The seatbelt sign was on. Anya was trying to restrain her, to shush her, but Lena was 3 and scared, and she wanted down. In a desperate bid for calm, Anya unbuckled the loop belt for a moment to adjust Lena's position. It was a 1-second lapse. It was all Lena needed. She squirmed free, dropped to the floor, and before Anya could grab her, she darted into the aisle. Not crying now. Intent. On a mission. She turned away from her mother, away from the crying, away from the fear, and started walking up the darkened aisle, dragging Binky by one ear, heading toward the only lighted doorway she could see at the front of the quiet, tense plane. In the aisle, Lena Petrova was on a walk. That was all. The plane was quiet. The grown-ups were scared. She didn't like it. So she walked toward the light, and the light was coming from a doorway where 2 men were very, very busy. Up front, the crisis was crystallizing into a single, terrifying equation. They were still 40 minutes from Shannon. The left engine's oil pressure was now in the red. A precautionary shutdown was imminent. Captain Vance knew the procedure by muscle memory. Secure the engine, feather the propeller. Except it was a jet, a fan, you feather the fan, you initiate the shutdown checklist. You declare a pan-pan or a mayday. You keep the aircraft flying on one engine. He'd done it in simulators 100 times, but the simulator didn't have the smell. It didn't have the ghost in the right seat. First Officer Shaw took the radios. His voice was steady, a lifeline of normalcy. "Shannon Control, Atlantic 602, we are declaring a pan-pan. We have a deteriorating left engine oil pressure, preparing for a precautionary shutdown, single engine. Request emergency services on landing." The response was immediate, professional. They were cleared for everything they needed. The path was being carved out of the sky for them. All Vance had to do was fly it. But the tremor in his hands was now a vibration he felt in his teeth. His vision began to tunnel, focusing on the primary flight display, blotting out the peripheral screens. The psychorespiratory cycle had him. His breathing was fast and shallow, starving his brain of oxygen just when he needed clarity most. He was gripping the yoke like it was a cliff edge. Vance didn't answer. He was staring at the engine indication screen, watching the number tick down. Each digit was a second off Marcus Chen's life. It was irrational. He knew it was irrational. But the part of his brain that knew things was being shouted down by the amygdala, the ancient alarm bell that only knew one thing: this is death. This is how death arrives. "Captain Vance," Shaw's voice was firmer now, a procedural nudge. They were burning through safe altitude. They needed to act. In the cabin, Anya Petrova was in a quiet frenzy. She had unbuckled herself, ignoring the seatbelt sign, and was crouched in the aisle, looking under seats. "Lena, baby, where are you?" Her whisper was frantic. A flight attendant rushed over, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, you need to be seated. We're preparing for an emergency landing." "My daughter, she's 3, she ran." Anya's voice cracked. The flight attendant's professional calm faltered for a microsecond. She looked up the dim aisle. She saw nothing but the legs of other anxious passengers. How long ago? A minute, maybe 2. She went that way. Anya pointed forward toward the business class cabin, toward the forward galley and the forbidden, reinforced door beyond it. The flight attendant's blood ran cold. She keyed her inner phone, calling the lead attendant in the forward galley. "Susan, we have a code. Unrestrained child, possibly moving forward. Can you visually confirm?" In the forward galley, lead flight attendant Susan Reed peered past the curtain. Her heart stopped. At the far end of the business class cabin, barely 3 feet tall, was a little girl in a pink shirt. She was standing perfectly still, looking at the cockpit door. More specifically, she was looking at the small, red, fold-down latch mechanism on the door's frame, the manual override, a safety feature meant for flight crew if the door locking system fails. It was supposed to be visually obscured, but on this aircraft, during a hurried interior refit 6 months prior, the covering bezel had been removed and never replaced. It was a tiny, gleaming red handle at exactly a toddler's eye level. He reached across. It was a breach of protocol. The pilot flying Vance should do it, but Vance was catatonic. As Shaw's hand moved toward the lever, Vance finally reacted. He slapped Shaw's hand away, a sudden, violent jerk. "Don't touch it." Shaw recoiled, shocked. The aircraft gave a slight lurch. "Captain, we have to secure it." "I know what we have to do," Vance roared, the sound raw and alien in the small space. The outburst seemed to startle even him. He sucked in a ragged breath. I have it. I have the controls." But his hands were shaking on the yoke. He was fighting the aircraft, not flying it, introducing tiny, jarring inputs. Over the interphone, Susan Reed's voice, tight with controlled urgency, filled the cockpit. "Captain, this is Lead. We have a situation. We have an unaccompanied infant in the forward cabin. She is near the flight deck door. We are attempting to retrieve her." The words cut through Vance's panic like a shard of ice. An infant, near the door. His mind, stuck in a loop of the past, now superimposed a new, impossible image. A child, in the doorway, like an omen, his breathing hitched. The air seemed too thin. Shaw responded, his voice a model of forced calm. "Understood, Lead. Retrieve the child and secure her immediately. Report when done." He turned to Vance. "Sir, we need to descend through 28,000. Your altitude." Vance was looking at the door, the physical, reinforced metal door to his left. He could imagine the small figure on the other side. It broke the spell of the Frankfurt memory but replaced it with a fresh, paralyzing horror. What if she gets in? Every regulation, every security briefing screamed that this was the ultimate failure. The sanctum was breached. The fortress was under siege by a toddler. On the other side of that door, Lena reached up. The red latch was fascinating. It looked like the handle on her grandmother's cookie jar. She stretched her small fingers. Susan Reed moved with silent speed, but she was 15 feet away and the aisle was narrow. "Sweetheart, no," she called out, her professional composure gone. Lena turned at the sound, her hand still outstretched. She wasn't afraid of this lady. She was curious. She looked from the woman's alarmed face back to the red handle, and she pushed it. It wasn't a lever you pull. It was a latch you depress and slide. Her small palm smacked against it. The mechanism clicked. Inside the cockpit, a new alarm sounded. A discreet, piercing tone, a door alert. On the overhead panel, a light illuminated, cockpit door unlocked. First Officer Shaw's head swiveled. His eyes widened in genuine disbelief. The door. Captain Vance looked at the light. It was a small, amber beacon in a sea of red and yellow warnings, but it was the one that broke him. The final layer of control, the absolute boundary between the chaos of the world and the ordered world of the flight deck, had been violated. By a child. A security breach of unimaginable magnitude was happening while he was helplessly watching an engine die. The two crises merged into a tsunami of failure. He let go of the yoke. His hands fell into his lap. He stared blankly at the instrument panel. "I can't," he whispered, a hollow sound lost in the engine hum and the blare of alerts. "Marcus, the door, I can't do this." The aircraft, with its autopilot still engaged but now with no pilot monitoring its path, began a slow, gentle drift off its assigned heading. Shaw saw it immediately. He had seconds. He could either try to fly the plane alone, manage the engine failure and talk air traffic control down, or he could try to save his captain. He couldn't do both. He made his choice. He keyed the mic, his voice now stripped bare of all pretense. "Shannon, Atlantic 602. Mayday, mayday, mayday. We have a pilot incapacitation. I say again, pilot incapacitation. I am the sole pilot. Single engine failure in progress. Request immediate direct vectors for the approach. Emergency personnel, we will need medical on landing. The words pilot incapacitation echoed across the ocean frequency, a rare and chilling call. In the cabin, the flight attendants heard it over the speakers. Anya Petrova, still in the aisle, began to sob. And outside the cockpit door, Susan Reed finally reached Lena. She scooped the girl into her arms. Lena, surprised, began to cry, reaching back for the interesting red handle. But the damage was done. The door was unlocked from the outside. It was no longer an impenetrable barrier. It was just a door. Inside, Shaw had taken the controls. He was running the engine shutdown checklist with one hand, correcting the aircraft's heading with the other, and speaking to ATC, his voice a rapid-fire staccato of pure procedure. He was now the definition of task-saturated. He didn't see Captain Vance slowly turn his head to look at the door. Vance's eyes were wide, unblinking, glazed with a shock so profound it was almost peaceful. The panic had burned itself out, leaving a silent, hollow wreck. He watched the door handle. It began to turn. Not from the outside mechanism, from the inside. In his catatonic state, a final, bizarre impulse fired through his neural wiring. If the door was unlocked, if the boundary was gone, then the threat was already inside. He had to see it. He had to face it. His hand moved almost without his volition, reaching across the center console, past Shaw, who was shouting numbers into the radio, and he pulled the interior door lever. With a heavy asterisk thunk, the cockpit door swung inward. And there in the doorway, held in the arms of a stricken flight attendant, was a 3-year-old girl with tear-streaked cheeks, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. She looked past the flight attendant, into the brightly lit, alarm-flashing room she wasn't ever supposed to see. Her eyes, wide with curiosity, landed directly on the man in the left seat, the man whose face was pale and wet with sweat, who was staring back at her as if she were a ghost. For a long, suspended second, the entire universe of Flight 602 narrowed to that silent stare between a broken captain and a lost child. Then Lena sniffled. She rubbed her nose with Binky's ear, and in a small, clear voice, muffled by the rabbit but perfectly audible in the sudden silence Shaw had left after his radio call, she pointed at the bewildering array of lights and said the only thing that made sense to her. "Your airplane is broken." The words hung in the space between blaring alarms, a simple, devastating diagnosis from a 3-year-old mechanic. And in that moment, something in Captain Vance's frozen mind cracked open, not with a snap, but with a whisper. He blinked. The terrifying mosaic of lights and screens didn't change, but his perception of them did. They were just parts of the airplane, a broken airplane. The little girl was right. It was a problem to be solved, not a phantom to be feared. His breathing, which had been trapped high in his chest, sank down to his diaphragm, one long, shuddering exhale. First Officer Shaw was staring, his hand hovering over the radio button, utterly lost. "Captain." Vance didn't look at him. He looked at Lena, who was now hiding her face in the flight attendant's neck. "It is broken," Vance said, his voice rough but deliberate. "We're going to fix it." He turned his head and his eyes met Shaw's. The vacancy was gone, replaced by a grim, exhausted clarity. "Report." It was a command, a return. Shaw, jolted into action, rattled off their status. Left engine secured, fuel imbalance stabilizing, single engine drift down profile established. We are 17 minutes from initial approach for Shannon. Winds are gusting across the runway. Vance's hands returned to the controls. The tremor was still there, but it was smaller now, a vibration he could work through. He took back piloting duties. "My aircraft." "Your aircraft," Shaw confirmed, a wave of relief so potent it felt like nausea. But the crisis was far from over. They were a crippled jet, heavy with unburned fuel, being flown by a pilot who had just emerged from a psychological abyss, with a toddler in his cockpit. Susan Reed, the lead attendant, stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to retreat or advance. "Susan," Vance said, not taking his eyes off the instruments, "secure the child in the jump seat. Now." His tone brooked no argument. It was the voice of a captain managing resources, even if the resource was a frightened little girl. Protocol screamed against it. A passenger, a child in a cockpit jump seat during an emergency. It was a regulatory nightmare. But the immediate alternative was to send her back into a cabin preparing for a possible crash landing with a mother in hysterics. Susan made a split-second decision. She moved into the cockpit, strapped a wide-eyed Lena into the fold-down jump seat behind Shaw, and fastened the harness over her and Binky. "You sit right here, sweetie. Be very brave." As she retreated, pulling the cockpit door closed but leaving it unlocked in case they needed her, Vance spoke again. "Shaw, get the mother on the interphone. Tell her the child is safe and with us." While Shaw made the call, a new voice came over the radio. It was the Atlantic Skyways dispatcher in New York, patched through via satellite. 602, we have your situation. Company emergency team is activated. Be advised, we are reviewing your fuel and weight data. Shannon's longest runway is 10,200 feet. With your current weight and single-engine configuration, your calculated landing distance is 9,800 feet. The numbers settled into the cockpit like a death sentence. They had a margin of 400 feet. 400 feet of pavement between a safe stop and an overrun into a field, in a 15-knot crosswind, with a tired captain and a first officer running on adrenaline. "That's assuming a perfect approach," Shaw murmured, his eyes on the performance chart. "And a perfect landing," Vance finished. He knew what the dispatcher wasn't saying. It was technically possible, but at the very razor's edge of the aircraft's capabilities. One slight float, one late touchdown, and they would run out of concrete. Then the dispatcher delivered the second blow. "Weather update for Shannon. A squall line is moving in faster than forecast. Current winds are 15 gusting 22. In 10 minutes, they're predicting 20 gusting to 35. Possible wind shear on final approach." 35 knots of gusting crosswind in a crippled heavy aircraft with a minimal runway margin. It was no longer a razor's edge. It was an impossibility. Vance felt the cold tendrils of panic try to curl around his spine again. He closed his eyes for a second. A small rustle came from behind him. He glanced back. Lena was looking at the overhead panel, her finger tracing shapes in the air, mimicking the lights. She was humming a tuneless song. The absurdity of it, the sheer, defiant normalcy of a child humming in the middle of a death sentence, anchored him. He keyed the mic. "Dispatch 602. Acknowledge. Shannon is becoming untenable. What are our alternates?" The silence on the other end was telling. They were over the North Atlantic. Their options were horrifyingly few. "Stand by, 602. Shaw was already pulling up charts. "The only other field within our single-engine range with a runway over 10,000 feet is Glasgow, but it's farther east, into the weather system, and we'd be burning critical fuel to get there." They were in a tightening vice. Every option was bad. Vance's mind, now clear, began working the problem with a brutal, surgical logic. They couldn't land heavy in Shannon with a gale blowing. They couldn't make it to another major airport without risking fuel exhaustion over water. They needed to get lighter, and they needed to do it fast. "We dump fuel," Vance said. Shaw shook his head. "Captain, the 777 can dump, but the manual states it's prohibited with a known engine failure. The asymmetric fuel dump could worsen the imbalance or affect controllability." "The manual was written for 2 working engines," Vance countered, his voice low. "We are out of manual scenarios. We have 203 souls on board and a 3-year-old in my cockpit. We are getting this aircraft light enough to land on a postage stamp, or we are going to put it in the water. Calculate the fuel dump to get us to our maximum landing weight. Do it now." It was a monumental risk. Dumping fuel with only the right engine operating could cause the aircraft to yaw violently, or the fuel might not stream clear, potentially causing a fire. But it was the only lever they had left to pull. As Shaw ran the numbers, a new, quiet voice came from the jump seat. "Mama." Vance looked back. Lena's lower lip was trembling. The bravery was wearing off. The strange lights and the serious men and the humming were giving way to the reality that she was lost, and her mama wasn't here. A single fat tear rolled down her cheek. In that moment, Elias Vance wasn't a captain. He was a man who had once wanted to be a father. The ghost of Marcus Chen faded, replaced by a living, breathing child who was scared. He did something he hadn't done in years. He softened his voice. "Your mama's right back there, Lena. She knows you're helping us. Can you be our brave lookout? Can you watch that red light right there?" He pointed to a non-critical status light on the rear panel. "You tell me if it turns green." It was a nonsense task, but it was a mission. Lena sniffed, wiped her nose with Binky, and squinted at the light. She gave a serious, tiny nod. Shaw had the numbers. "Dump plan calculated. It will take approximately 8 minutes. We'll be at the edge of our fuel for a go-around, but we'll be at landing weight." "Initiate," Vance said. The fuel dump switch was guarded. Shaw lifted the guard and pressed it. A low rumble vibrated through the airframe as thousands of pounds of jet fuel began streaming from the wings into the sky over the Atlantic. The aircraft became subtly livelier in Vance's hands, lighter. But the universe had one more card to play. The interphone buzzed. It was Susan Reed again, her voice strained. "Captain, we have a secondary issue. Passenger in row 14 is a physician. He's reported to us that the gentleman in 13B, an elderly passenger, is experiencing severe chest pain and shortness of breath. He believes it may be a cardiac event." Shaw put his head in his hands. "You have got to be kidding me." Vance felt a hysterical laugh bubble in his throat. A heart attack. Now, of course. The pressure in the cabin, the anxiety, the descent. It was a predictable, horrific addition to their cascade. They now had a medical emergency compounding their mechanical and weather emergency. "Is the physician assisting?" Vance asked, his voice miraculously steady. "Yes, Captain. He and a nurse are with him. We have the medical kit, but he's recommending the most rapid landing possible." Rapid, not careful, not precise. Rapid. The exact opposite of what their hair-thin margin required. Vance closed his eyes. He could see the spreadsheet of disaster. Every minute of delay for a smoother approach could kill the man in 13B. Every rushed, unstable approach could kill everyone else. He made a decision, one that would be picked apart in 1,000 boardrooms later. "Inform the physician we are doing everything humanly possible. We are 8 minutes from final approach. We will be on the ground in 15. Prepare the cabin for a firm landing." He switched back to the radio. "Shannon, Atlantic 602, update our situation. We are dumping fuel to landing weight. We now also have an onboard medical emergency, suspected cardiac. Request priority handling and emergency medical services to meet us on the runway. We will be making a straighten approach. We cannot delay." The controller's voice for the first time betrayed a hint of strain. "Roger, 602, all traffic is being cleared for you. The wind is now 20 gusting 30. The squall is hitting the field. You are cleared for the ILS approach to runway 24. Report established." Vance looked at Shaw. "You have the radios and the monitoring. I'm flying this one. No autopilot." He needed to feel every shudder, every gust in his hands. The fuel dump completed. They were at weight. The sky outside the cockpit had turned from blue to a bruised, tumultuous gray. Rain began to smear the windshield. The aircraft started to buck and shudder in the turbulent air. Lena's voice, small but clear, piped up. "The light is still red." Vance almost smiled. "Good job, keep watching." They began their final descent. The runway, a slim gray thread in the mist, was still miles ahead. The wind screamed around them, trying to push them off the localizer beam. Vance's hands danced on the controls, making constant, tiny corrections. His world shrank to the view out the window and the feel of the aircraft. The ghost was gone. The past was gone. There was only the now, the storm, the strip of pavement, and the quiet breathing of a little girl behind him. Shaw called out their altitudes and speeds, his voice a steady chant against the howl of wind and engine. 1,000 feet to minimums, speed 150, slight left correction, wind shear alert, 15 knot loss, recover, recover. Vance fought the sinking feeling, added power, felt the single engine groan in response. The aircraft wallowed, then stabilized. 500 feet, runway in sight, airspeed good, but you're left of center line. Vance could see it. The wind was shoving him. He fed in right rudder aileron, fighting the asymmetric thrust of the one good engine. The runway lights streamed toward them crooked. He wasn't lined up. He was running out of altitude, out of time, out of ideas. And from the jump seat, Lena, who had been silent for minutes, pointed a tiny finger at the approaching lights and said, with the absolute certainty of a child who knows nothing about crosswind landings, "You need to slide." Vance's eyes flicked from the runway to the controls and back. Slide. Not turn. Slide. In a flash of instinct that bypassed all training, he understood. He couldn't just point the nose at the runway. He had to crab the whole aircraft sideways like a car on ice to offset the wind's push. It was a technique, a dangerous one, but the only way to get lined up in the seconds he had left. He stomped on the rudder, banked slightly into the wind, and the 777 slipped sideways through the rain. Its nose pointed away from the runway, but its path suddenly, miraculously aligned with the center line. Shaw's voice was a whisper, 100 feet, 50, 30. Vance pulled the nose up, flaring, killing their rate of descent. The main wheels touched down with a firm, solid squeal, not a crash. He immediately slammed the engines into full reverse thrust, standing on the brakes. The anti-skid system chattered violently as the heavy aircraft decelerated, eating up the precious pavement. Out the window, the runway edge lights blurred past. The end of the runway and the muddy field beyond rushed toward them. The brakes screamed. The speed bled off, 80 knots, 60, 40. They rolled to a stop with 200 feet of runway to spare. The cockpit was silent except for the hiss of rain and the heavy breathing of two men. Then from behind them came a soft, satisfied sigh. The light is still red. Captain Vance slowly turned his head. He looked at Lena, still strapped in her seat, clutching her rabbit, her job faithfully done. He then looked at First Officer Shaw, whose face was pale and slick with sweat. He keyed the mic one last time, his voice utterly drained. Shannon Atlantic 602. On the ground at time, 0947 Zulu. Request emergency services and a very long stairway. But as the emergency vehicles, their lights flashing through the rain, converged on the stationary aircraft, the real storm was just beginning. Because while 203 people had just been given their lives back, the world outside was about to ask the question that would define the rest of Captain Elias Vance's life. Who saved whom? And at what cost? The silence inside the cockpit was shattered by the wail of sirens. Outside, in the relentless Irish rain, a story was solidifying into legend. But inside the metal skin of the Valkyrie, there were only human beings, shattered and saved, trying to understand what had just happened. First Officer Shaw reached over and gently disengaged the autopilot, a final symbolic gesture. The aircraft was done flying. He then turned to the jump seat and began unbuckling Lena, his hands shaking. "Okay, brave lookout, your job is done. Let's get you back to your mama." Captain Vance didn't move. He sat, hands still on the yoke, staring at the rain-streaked windshield as fire trucks surrounded them, painting the cockpit in flashes of red and white. The adrenaline that had carried him through the landing was receding, and in its place flooded a cold, comprehensive exhaustion. He had come back from the abyss, but he could still feel its chill. The cockpit door opened. Susan Reed's face appeared, pale but composed. Behind her, Anya Petrova was sobbing, held back by another attendant. When Lena saw her mother, she scrambled out of Shaw's grasp and ran into Anya's arms. The reunion was a silent, fierce clutching in the cramped doorway, a moment of pure, private relief that none of the cameras now rushing to the perimeter would ever see. Paramedics boarded quickly. The elderly passenger in 13B was stabilized and taken off first on a stretcher. He would survive. The other passengers, shepherded by the crew, disembarked down air stairs onto the wet tarmac, where buses waited to take them to the terminal. Many were crying. Some hugged the flight attendants. No one cheered. There was only the profound, trembling quiet of people who have walked up to a cliff's edge and somehow stepped back. For Captain Vance and First Officer Shaw, the process was different. They were met not by paramedics, but by officials from the Irish Air Accident Investigation Unit and a stern-faced representative from Atlantic Skyways. The debriefing began right there, in a converted airport conference room, while the rain beat against the windows. The questions were precise, relentless, and devoid of emotion. They covered every second from the first oil pressure warning to the final full stop. They focused on Vance's period of incapacitation. They focused on the cockpit door breach. They focused on the decision to dump fuel with a failed engine. They focused, with particular intensity, on the presence of a child on the flight deck. Vance answered with a flat, factual tone. He did not hide his breakdown. I was non-responsive for approximately 70 seconds. First Officer Shaw correctly assumed pilot incapacitation and declared the mayday. My re-engagement was triggered by an external stimulus. He did not elaborate. He simply stated that he had resumed his duties and flown the approach and landing. The investigators listened, their faces unreadable. The story was preposterous on paper. A pilot loses his nerve, a toddler unlocks the door, the sight of the child somehow restores the pilot, who then performs a near-impossible landing. It sounded like a fable, not an air accident report. Meanwhile, in another part of the terminal, Lena Petrova, now wearing an oversized Shannon Airport security shirt, was sitting on a blanket, coloring with markers provided by a kind agent. The world's media was already clamoring outside for the miracle toddler. But for now, she was just a little girl who'd had a very long day and wanted her rabbit. The storm of public narrative, however, was already forming. A passenger had tweeted a blurry photo of the cockpit door just as Susan Reed was scooping Lena up. The caption read, "A baby just came out of the cockpit during our emergency. What is happening?" It went viral in minutes. By the time the sun set over Shannon, the story had been framed. A heroic pilot saved by a mysterious, calming child. Atlantic Skyways' PR department went into overdrive, trying to control a story that had more holes than substance. They issued a vague statement praising the crew's professionalism and the swift response of airport authorities. They said nothing about the captain's crisis. They said nothing about a child in the cockpit. But the investigation had the cockpit voice recorder. They had the data. And they had the testimony of First Officer Shaw, who, when asked privately what had changed, said quietly, "She said the airplane was broken. And the captain, he decided to fix it. I can't explain it. That's what happened." Back in New York, the FAA launched its own parallel inquiry. The regulatory implications were staggering. A security breach of the flight deck was a Category 1 event. A pilot's incapacitation had to be reviewed for medical certification. The unauthorized fuel dump would be a compliance nightmare. The airline braced for massive fines and operational audits. Captain Vance was suspended on the spot, pending the outcome. He was flown back to New York 2 days later, not in a pilot's uniform, but in a passenger seat. He spent the following weeks in a strange purgatory, meeting with company lawyers, union representatives, and his own therapist, who he had quietly resumed seeing. The official investigation report took 4 months. Its conclusions were a masterclass in bureaucratic balancing. It cited the missing bezel on the cockpit door override latch as a critical maintenance failure. It documented Captain Vance's acute stress reaction, linking it to his prior traumatic event, and noted the airline's psychological aftercare had been insufficient. It stated that the fuel dump, while a deviation, was a justifiable choice given the deteriorating weather and aircraft weight. It praised First Officer Shaw's actions as exemplary. And in one brief, dry paragraph on page 47, it addressed the child. The presence of an unauthorized minor on the flight deck during a critical phase of flight constitutes a serious security lapse. However, the investigation could not establish a causal link between this presence and the subsequent actions of the flight crew that led to the safe outcome. In other words, they couldn't prove she helped, but they couldn't prove she didn't. The media didn't care for nuance. The story was too perfect. The hardened captain, softened by a child's innocence, finding his courage again. It was a myth that wanted to be believed. Vance found himself hailed as a hero in one headline and scrutinized as a liability in the next. The airline, facing public relations disaster, made a calculation. They couldn't fire a pilot the world saw as a hero, but they couldn't let him fly again with the same certification. A deal was struck. Captain Elias Vance would take an early medical retirement. There would be no admission of fault from either side. His record would remain clean. The story would be allowed to fade. For Vance, it was a kind of death. Flying was his identity. It was taken from him not by a crash, but by a crack in his own mind that a little girl had briefly shone a light through. He moved to a small house in Vermont, near no airports. He didn't touch a flight simulator. He took up woodworking, building things that stayed firmly on the ground. But the story had one more loop to close. On the first anniversary of the landing, a small package arrived at his Vermont home. No return address. Inside was a child's drawing. It was on a piece of expensive art paper, and it showed a large, wobbly airplane with one big red wing and one blue wing. Next to it stood a stick figure with a hat, and next to that, a tiny stick figure with a scribble of brown curls, holding a blob that was presumably a rabbit. At the bottom, in an adult's handwriting, it said, "Lena wanted you to have this. She says you fixed it. Thank you, Anya." Vance framed the drawing. He hung it in his workshop where he could see it while he sanded and planed. He never contacted them. He knew the myth had probably been hard on them too. But the drawing was a truth that existed outside of reports and headlines. It was a truth about a broken airplane and two people, one very large, one very small, who worked together to fix it. Back in Brooklyn, Lena Petrova grew. She didn't remember much of the flight. She remembered the nice man who let her watch the red light. She remembered her mother's tight hug. The media offers for interviews, book deals, and movie rights came and were quietly refused by Anya, who wanted only a normal life for her daughter. The money from a confidential settlement with the airline, stemming from the faulty door latch, allowed Anya to build a stable graphic design business from home. She never had to choose between rent and childcare again. The final, surprising detail emerged years later, buried in an industry safety newsletter. Following the incident, the FAA issued a new advisory circular. It wasn't about cockpit security or pilot psychology. It was about maintenance documentation for interior modifications. It mandated that any alteration to a flight deck door or its surrounding area, no matter how minor, required a specific double sign-off inspection to ensure no safety-critical features were exposed. They called it the Petrova check. The name was a coincidence, a bureaucrat's homage to a story he'd heard. But in thousands of aircraft hangars around the world, mechanics now performed the Petrova check, unaware that it was named for a 3-year-old girl who once pointed at a broken airplane and changed everything. The storm passed. The Valkyrie was repaired and returned to service. First Officer Shaw made captain within 2 years. Susan Reed retired on schedule. And in the quiet of a Vermont workshop, a former captain looked at a child's drawing of an airplane and felt, for the first time since that rainy day in Shannon, a sense of peace that was not about flying, but about landing. So what do we do with a story like this? A story that lives in the hazy border between a violation and a miracle, between a breakdown and a breakthrough. The official record has its conclusions. The maintenance log, the pilot's file, the regulatory amendments, they tell a story of errors corrected and procedures tightened. They tell the story we can file away and quantify. But the human record, the one written in memory and framed in a Vermont workshop, tells a different story. It suggests that sometimes in the absolute crucible of fear, the thing that reconnects a person to their own courage isn't another procedure. It's a connection, however small, however unlikely, however against the rules. Captain Vance didn't need a co-pilot in that moment. He needed an anchor. And an anchor, it turns out, can be 3 feet tall and holding a stuffed rabbit. Lena didn't calm him with wisdom. She grounded him with a simple, undeniable reality. There was a problem, and he was the one who could fix it. She restored his context. She made him a captain again by needing one. We spend our lives building fortresses of expertise and protocol, and that's good. It keeps us safe. But this story whispers a dangerous, beautiful truth. Sometimes the fortress itself becomes the trap, and the key that unlocks it might not be a better tool from inside, but a tiny, unexpected knock from outside. Flight 602 didn't change aviation because a toddler is now part of the emergency checklist. It changed aviation because it reminded everyone who works in that vast, technical ecosystem that at the very center of it all, in every cockpit, in every control tower, is a human heart. And human hearts under enough pressure can forget how to beat. Sometimes, all it takes is the steady, fearless rhythm of another to remind them. That's the kind of story we are here to tell. Not just stories of disaster averted, but of humanity rediscovered in the most improbable places. At 37,000 feet, in a silent study, in the quiet moment when one person's brokenness meets another's unformed courage. If this story reminded you of a time when an unexpected person reached you, or when you found the strength to reach for someone else against all odds, then you understand why these narratives matter. They are the counterweight to the noise. They are the quiet proof that our deepest rescues are often mutual, messy, and absolutely real. Share this with someone who needs to hear that today. Leave a comment about a moment when a small connection made a big difference. And if you believe in stories that sit with the complexity of being human, then subscribe. We'll be here, waiting for the next one word.